Excellent. Thank you. So, welcome. We're glad that you're here. As we begin the service, let's process in together, even as we're all separate, by singing Enter, Rejoice, and Come In. All right, so we're having some sound difficulties, which, is part of the deal. So we can all sing at home because we pretty much know the words. Does that mean I need to lead? Ugh. Okay, I'll lead. Enter, rejoice, and zoom in. Enter, rejoice, and zoom in. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and zoom in. Don't be afraid of some change. Don't be afraid of some change. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and zoom in. Yeah. Sharon is our worship associate today, and she'll introduce our chalice lighting.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sharon Whitehill, the worship associate for today. First, please wait to light your chalice at home until after the affirmation. And now the words for our chalice liturgy. Blessed is the fire that burns deep in the soul. It is the flame of the human spirit touched into being by the mystery of life. O sacred flame, guide us with the light of hope, with the warmth of love, with the beacon of purpose and meaning. Because we are all afraid of the dark, let there be light.
Thank you, Sharon. And now join with me in reciting the affirmation as I light our chalice. Love is the spirit of this fellowship, and service is its law. This is our aspiration, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And now I'll give those of you who have something to light at home a moment to light your own chalice before we go on. Thank you for doing that. And now we'll have opening words. Here's Sharon again.
The opening words this morning. All right, the opening words this morning are in two parts. The first is a statement by Kristen Armstrong, the former professional road bicycle racer. She writes, I want to get more comfortable being uncomfortable. I want to get more confident being uncertain. I don't want to shrink back just because something isn't easy. I want to push back and make more room in the area between I can and I can't. The second set of opening words is a famous passage from Rainer Maria Rilke in his Letters to a Young Poet. Have patience with everything that remains unsolved in your heart. Try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books written in a foreign language. Do not now look for the answers. They cannot now be given to you because you could not live them. It is a question of experiencing everything. At present, you need to live the question. Perhaps you will gradually, without even noticing it, find yourself experiencing the answers some distant day.
Thank you, Sharon. For our song this morning, we're going to share another song that the choir has created for us called Sit at the Welcome Table. It's something that we've sung here before. You should be hopefully pretty familiar with that. But the message of the song is about how we are creating a welcoming space. We're going to sit at the welcome table someday. We're going to be together someday. And it's not about being in this COVID-19 culture. It's really about being welcoming. And today's message, the report on institutional change, it's about being welcoming. So it fits very well. So let's sing together at home. We're going to sit at the welcome table with the help of our choir. Thank you again to Jim and to Linda and to the choir members who participate in making these videos. It's a nice touch to bring us together in a time that makes that super difficult. As we move into our weekly segment of Member Spotlight, we're going to get to know Mary Jane Williams today. She has been our office administrator for just over a year, and many of us interact with her in an official capacity whenever we call the office or email or need information. But let's get a chance to get to know her more on a personal level. Mary Jane?
Okay. A lot of people know me, but there's some new people or some people that I haven't really interacted with. So I thought you should get to put a face with the messages you get that are just signed MJ. That would be me. I was born and raised a serious Roman Catholic. 12 years at Catholic schools, including 4 years at a Catholic girls' school for high school. had questions starting early on with a lot of things. I couldn't understand the concept of original sin. It didn't make any sense to me. The Trinity didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. The concept of hell didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I had these great nuns all through school who, when they got tired of answering my questions, would shut it all down with the comment, "It's a matter of faith." As I got a little older, they would shut it down with, "That's heresy." But in general, they were all pretty cool. And high school, girls Catholic high school, nothing wrong with that. It's the example of women in power was one that you didn't see a lot of back in that day. There was their own version of feminism. They were very strong advocates for social justice. We were going out and working in the projects in Cleveland when I was a freshman in high school. So I grew up with that kind of a foundation where I really believed in the Beatitudes. I believed in the idea of forgiving somebody 70 times 7 times. I believed in social justice. I believed in women being able to do things and control things and run things. I had 3 brothers at home, so surrounded by women was a good thing for me because I tended to be outnumbered on everything. As an adult, I really thought I should find something else, but I had absolutely no interest in any other Christian religion. I mean, it was just that wasn't going to work. So I dabbled with all kinds of fun things, but never could really commit to anything because on top of being raised Catholic, I was raised by 2 very controlling, anal retentive parents who kind of drummed into us an all or nothing attitude about things. So if I couldn't fully commit, then I couldn't do it. At one point, Miles, my husband and love of my life, decided that we needed something because we hadn't been doing any religious activities together. So he did a whole lot of research and came up with the idea that Unitarian Universalism was what we should be. So I said, fine, whatever. And then I started reading and researching and decided that basically I had been a UU my entire life without realizing it. From the moment we walked in the door, you know, we were fully committed. And it's been great. I love everybody. My basic philosophy in life is that everybody is a decent person. Everybody is capable of change and redemption and doing magnificent things. I'm a personal nonviolent pacifist advocate, realizing that it's not necessarily practical or possible, but it would be my dream for the world. That's about it. I'm happy to talk to anybody anytime. If I'm ever brusque or cut you off in any way, it's generally because I'm involved in something else and my brain is distracted. But in general, you know, I'll talk to any of you anytime. So I look forward to seeing everybody again in person someday. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And certainly one of the big joys I've had since I've started here as the minister is to get to know Mary Jane and to work with her on a daily basis. I think that we work pretty well together and really appreciate that relationship. So thank you so much, Mary Jane, for all that you do and for helping me to feel welcome and to cover up for so many of my mistakes that I make. At this time, we'd like to invite you to write joys and concerns, time that we would have for what we usually call the Book of Life, but to write those today in the chat room so that we can see concerns you might have about health, about friends, about relatives, about neighbors, or to share a joy with you, with us, something wonderful that's happening in your life, or some great news that you've received so that we can rejoice along with you. We're going to share a song and instrumental, and as long as that song is playing, this is a time for you to write in the chat room the joys and concerns that you have that are just part of our life at this time. So let's go ahead and have that moment now. Thank you to those of you who shared. At this time, let's enter into a moment of silent meditation, a chance for us to meditate on the items that have been shared with us, but also to silently think about what's been happening in your life and your world over the past week or so. It's a chance to release the burdens and pressure and stress that you feel to the universe, or a chance to share the wondrous joy in many ways that you've experienced with the universe as well. After a moment, I will sound a ding on the bell, and then we will enjoy Spirit of Life together. So let's have a moment of silence at this time. Just a reminder at this time that we are continuing to receive your offerings, not in the basket, but either by regular mail, or if you have a Venmo app on your smartphone, we are taking offerings through that as well. And you can designate those offerings for the general fund as part of your pledge, or for our second helping offerings as we're continuing to collect money for food banks in the area with our still a lot of people without jobs or with a low income who need that kind of support, and our food banks continue to have extra stress at this time. So thank you for continuing to give so that we can continue to pay our bills and continue to reach the community through our different efforts at this time. UUFCC, of course, is a predominantly white religious fellowship affiliated with a predominantly white denomination located squarely in a predominantly white area of Florida. That matters because it shapes who we are, how we operate, and how we think. Today, I want to spend some time going back to our Unitarian Universalist General Assembly. And one of the major things that happened during that time was a discussion of this book that was released by our Commission on Institutional Change called Widening the Circle of Concern. As we think about matters of race, matters of our congregation and our community and our world at this time, I need to point out that Friday, America lost two really important Black figures from the civil rights movement. Reverend C.T. Vivian and Representative John Lewis both passed away. Unfortunately, yesterday, while several white Republicans were trying to share their thoughts of condolences, many of them on social media mixed up pictures of the late Representative Elijah Cummings with John Lewis, showing in fact some of their own ignorance or lack of care or detail about the Black person that they claim to be honoring. And it shows the message that even sometimes with what we think is our best effort, we often make mistakes. Not just mistakes that are little, but mistakes that send a message about how much we really don't care about getting things right when it comes to race relations. It's not a funny mistake, and it's one indicator of a problem that few whites like me can understand. Back in 2016, 4 years ago, the southern region of the Unitarian Universalist Association had a longtime director by the name of Ken Hurto who retired. Not really a big thing. A lot of congregation has worked with Ken. Maybe many of you knew Ken in some way. He probably spoke here at various times during his tenure as director of the southern region. So of course, when he retired, it meant that somebody needed to replace him. Well, there were a couple of folks who had been involved with the region and with the UUA that UUA leadership decided to hire or appoint as co-leads for the southern region. Well, this seemingly benign act created a lot of outrage because the UUA did not go through typical hiring processes. They didn't really look at other people who were interested. Yes, they had applications, but they didn't really narrow those applications down. They didn't have a lot of interviews. And there were two white people who were hired as co-leads without even interviewing many people of color who were highly qualified, who would have been great in that role. That created a backlash, a lot of controversy, and has led us down the road of truly examining who we are as Unitarian Universalists when it comes to race relations and the white supremacist, white-centered role of leadership within the denomination really throughout the entire history. The result of that problem was the instituting of a Commission on Institutional Change. This commission was made up entirely of leadership from within the congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association and entirely made up of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. No white people on this commission at all. They spent years asking questions, doing interviews, consulting with outside consultants about exactly what our issues are, and coming up with a lengthy report on ideas on what we need to do to change, to de-center whiteness in our denomination. There was a lot of different issues that this report brings up, a lot of issues that the commission uncovered. They had a time for a lot of discussion and analyzing their data. The charge from the 2017 General Assembly that they were given when they created this commission was to conduct an audit of power structures and analyze systemic racism and white supremacy culture within the UUA, as an organization, by the way, not by individual congregations. So while this report informs us and gives us some things to think about as an individual congregation, it's really a report about the national and international Unitarian Universalist Association as a whole. There were two major ideas that led this group as they were doing their work. One is that they insisted on being theologically grounded. Now, when we talk about theology as Unitarian Universalists, we're not talking necessarily about something that has to do with God or gods, capital G, lowercase g, or any one religion. Theology as Unitarian Universalists is really about how we think about the world, the big questions of life, such as why we are here, what is our purpose, and what, if anything, controls the universe or influences who we are as individuals. So being theologically grounded, you might say, really has to do with the philosophy of who we are and what we do as Unitarian Universalists. That was their number one guiding principle. Everything has to be theologically grounded. The second one is the idea of covenant. Covenant, we have in place of a lot of rules and regulations that helps to guide our relationships with each other, so that when we are not in right relationship, we have a way to come back into a healthy relationship. Covenant is what helps us get along, and what helps me say that you are valuable, and what helps you say we are all valuable. And this is the promise I make to be a part of this community. The process that the commission went through included a few different stages. They started by what they call a call for testimony. They wanted to hear from people of color who had been wronged either in small ways or in large ways, whether it was once or repeatedly, whether they were lay people or ministers or staff of our various UU congregations, or had worked with the denominational headquarters in Boston. What were their experiences? Then they also had some focus groups, people that they brought together to ask questions, to do some listening, and made a list of observations and analysis from that. They collaborated with outside consultants who were experts in helping organizations look at racism and diversity and inclusion. A couple of years ago, they did a very massive survey at General Assembly of all of the delegates and people who were attended. Some of that was done on paper, some was done through the General Assembly app that they made for smartphones. And then to bring all of this together, they used some techniques from social science research, using written and video interviews and looking for key words that they collated to look for commonalities. And then, of course, all along the way, there were invitations to make comment, to share, to question the work. It was very transparent. There were a lot of discussions, and there will be a lot of discussions that come out of the work of the commission. So as you read this book, it's written up into some very small chapters and a lot of different topics. And ultimately, there's a bunch of suggestions that they make, recommendations for what the UUA could be doing or ought to be doing, and a few recommendations that really impact us on the congregational level. So I want to share just a few thoughts from the book, from the different chapters, about what we maybe could be doing as we think about how to change, how to become better, how to de-center whiteness in our own congregation, says the white minister. but also to look at ourselves, our own lives, and our interpersonal relationships as well. To go back to a few of the early emphases that I was talking about, theological grounding is the very first chapter where they make some recommendations. Again, the idea of theological grounding is not based on God or any one religion. It's based on how we understand theology as Unitarian Universalists. And it's the idea that theology guides everything that we do. Our spiritual understanding of the world, or if the world is not influenced by spirituality, that also guides our thinking and how we interact with others. The idea is that our incredible diversity as Unitarian Universalists is a strength, but it's a strength that comes with challenges that we must meet. They also discuss the idea, the misguided idea, that Unitarian Universalism means that you can believe anything you want. That is not at all what Unitarian Universalism is all about. It's not what I preach, it's not what I teach, and it's not an acceptable idea for a way to describe Unitarian Universalism. Some of the specific actions that they recommend that might apply to us is the idea to read more theology from people of color, to learn perspectives from Black, Indigenous, and other people of color as they write about their own spiritual experiences. That way we can learn to get inside the thought process and understand how people very different from us look at spirituality. And then to focus on our own anti-oppression efforts. I know that many of us participate in marches or demonstrations to try to raise awareness or to stand alongside of organizations or individuals in our community. But is that really all that we should be doing? What else can we learn? What are some other opportunities for us? The next topic they talk about is governance, the idea of how we govern ourselves, how we organize. It talks about informal processes that tend to give power to a few. We don't pay much attention to the bylaws, to the policies and procedure. We'd like to handle things much more casually, but when we deal with things casually, that tends to reinforce the power of the people that already have the power, and it doesn't really give voice to minority opinions in one way or another. They also talk about the expense that it takes to send delegates to General Assembly. We're fortunate, we're blessed, we're privileged in that we have a large number of our members who usually can afford to attend General Assembly either virtually, online, or they go in person. That's not true of a lot of congregations, and it's certainly not true of everyone within our fellowship. So they recommend the idea of looking at the expense and looking at the way that General Assembly is done, because it's not truly democratic in the way that we talk about the democratic process. If only delegates have a say in the direction of the denomination, and only delegates can go because they have enough money, then that means there's a lot of folks who cannot afford to go and their voices aren't heard and aren't represented. That's not true democracy. The business and the voting processes at General Assembly don't reflect our stated values. While we try to operate by Robert's Rules of Order, it's been pretty evident the past several years that Robert's Rules of Order are written by people with power to keep that power. And in order to try to mitigate that, the UUA instituted a new rule that allows delegates to suspend the rules to continue to vote. But what that has done is that it shuts down, again, opposing voices. It calls for a vote sooner than allowing interaction between people who are for something and others who are against something. So it actually has made things worse, the changes that they've made. Some of the actions that they recommended are to re-examine the bylaws for words and ideas of patriarchy and white culture. We are actually doing that work right now in our congregation. We have a small ad hoc committee who is looking at our bylaws and making some changes that they will recommend to the board and that will come to the congregation, hopefully in the spring, that will be more reflective of who we are, who we want to be, and the realities of our culture as required by the state of Florida to have in a set of bylaws. So we're doing some of that work. Also, to focus on accurately understanding the governance in a UU context, which again means the focus on covenant, our relationship with each other, and our emphasis on living out the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Our bylaws, our rules, our policies and procedures have to reflect those as real, true, living values that we have as a congregation. The next chapter that they have is on congregations and communities. Some of the core assumptions from this chapter talk about face-to-face community being invaluable to our faith as humans. Of course, they finished writing this report in the midst of this pandemic when they couldn't meet together face-to-face anymore, when our congregations aren't meeting face-to-face, when General Assembly wasn't face-to-face, all of that being virtual. But we recognize that face-to-face is what we value as humans. It's what we need, face-to-face conversations, hugs and handshakes. This is how we relate to each other. But alternative technology can help us gather and can help people who might not feel good or might be homebound to gather with us. So using technology in a way to enhance those relationships as well. They recommend adding budget money or a budget line to help pay for scholarships for delegates to General Assembly, or at least part of the way, emphasizing people of color or other marginalized people to pay the full expenses, not just the registration fee, but including travel expenses and housing expenses. They recommend communicating more often about the work of the Unitarian Universalist Association, something to which I am dedicating myself over the next year, so that we can know as a congregation what's happening with the UUA, ways that we can be connected, ideas and people and movements with which we can participate, but also to give us a chance to critique what's happening at the UUA. We don't have to like everything. We're UUs. We get to criticize stuff. And sometimes we get to rejoice what's happening in Boston, and sometimes we get to question that. And that is an important part of who we are. But again, also to re-emphasize our covenant of right relations. We do have one here at UUFCC. It's on posters in a couple different places in the building. It helps guide us in how we relate to one another. We will be having more conversations about that over the coming months. The next section is about hospitality and inclusion. Have you ever heard or seen any microaggressions at UUFCC in discussions with visitors who are people of color, or maybe even our regular attenders, our members who are people of color? Have you ever heard or seen anything like this? Oh, is this your first visit to a UU church? Oh, your English is really good. Maybe if you stay, you could join the Racial Justice Committee. Oh, your child's hair is beautiful, and then asking to touch it or just touching it without asking. All of those things may sound innocent or realistic to you, but they are in fact racial microaggressions. They show our ignorance or lack of concern as white people towards minorities. We don't understand how that impacts the way people think and the way they feel. So a couple of action steps that I'm asking that we take is to educate our greeters and our ushers about appropriate ways to welcome new visitors, how to talk to one another, how to talk to minorities so that we get a chance to listen and learn from their experiences. But also to think about our budget and our finances, how we can budget for our leaders to attend workshops, classes, retreats, etc., to address issues of inclusion, and how we can encourage our Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are friends and members of the congregation to participate in those as well. The next section is called Living Our Values. We have 7 key principles and a lot of unwritten or unspoken values that we claim are important to us. They lead, though, often to different levels of oppression without realizing it. There's personal oppression, things that you say to yourself that hold you down, that are critical, that are negative, that show that you might not love or value yourself as much as you should. There's interpersonal oppression, things that we say or do to others to hold them down, that don't give them power, that somehow we do that to lift ourselves up. There are institutional levels of oppression where we have policies, rules, guidelines, ways of operating that hold people down, that don't allow people to rise and come in and truly feel included. And then, of course, there are cultural levels of oppression, part of which we've been addressing over the past several months, as you see on the news, and some of you have participated in yourself. Our values that we claim to have as Unitarian Universalists call us to specific actions to help address this. Some things that occur to me that we could be doing as a fellowship would be to research this area's cultural, racial, and class history and our current realities. We have many people in the area that are doing some of that work and have been fantastic at that. And in fact, in a couple weeks, James Abraham will be here to talk about some of that. So certainly hope that you will come and hear what he has to say. Attend his workshops and his classes that he does. Also to create opportunities to interact with Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our area. I know that we've done a bunch of this, but there's always more that can be done. When last fall, the ladies had a luncheon with the ladies from the Muslim community. That's a fantastic way to interact. Many of us go to different activities in the community that are sponsored by some of our racial minorities and to involve ourselves with some of their organizations. This is important work. We get to say, yay, we're doing that. Of course, there's more to be done. To coordinate with other social groups in the area that focus on social justice. Again, we often do financial contributions to some of these groups. Some of us are involved on boards or committees or work with some of those groups, and that's fantastic. There's also a chapter on religious professionals, which includes myself, includes Jim as our music director, includes somebody that we might hire as a religious education director in some way, but people whose job it is to help the religious spiritual life of the congregation. Some of the observations of the task force of the commission was that it's often, almost always in fact, too expensive for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to pursue ministry, because just going through the process to get approved is really expensive. But of course, going to seminary is usually prohibitively expensive for most people. More diversity is needed in our ministerial ranks. And while at General Assembly, they've done a great job of inviting people from a more diverse background to be speakers and workshop leaders, there's a lot of folks in our congregations who could have fantastic impacts as leaders, and they simply cannot afford to do that. So a couple of the recommendations that I would like for us to encourage would be creating an alternative path to ministry, such as through apprenticeships. I know that in the past, UUFCC has had interns, which is fantastic. That's an important role for us to have, and I want that to continue. But if there's an opportunity for us to bring in someone for a long-term apprenticeship that may be 2 or 3 or 4 years to learn about ministry, that would be an alternative path to leadership and being fellowshipped by the denomination, that's something I would love for us to be involved with, that kind of creativity. And then continuing education requirements. Up until this point, you become a UU minister, you become fellowship by the denomination, you get a job as a minister with our congregation. You never have to do any other reading or learning or taking any other classes or seminars in order to continue to be fellowshipped. That is now being corrected. We now have a requirement every 3 years to have a certain number of continuing education units so that we can continue to grow and to learn about our role as ministers, about our culture, about some of the weak spots that we have to work on. So that is an excellent change. It talks about religious education and how in the past, with many UU curriculums, the idea, while it was unwritten, was that we wanted to raise our children and teach our members to be colorblind. People often say, when I meet someone or interact with somebody, I don't see color. I don't care if they're black or brown or yellow or whatever. That is the wrong message to send. We need to care about the color of people's skins because that influences and impacts who they are. It tells us something about their life experience. So that has to be changed. We cannot afford to be colorblind if we truly want to integrate and show value to people of color. We have to examine our unconscious biases. That means, how do we learn about biases we don't even know we have? You cannot recognize an issue if you don't know that you have the issue. This is work for us to do. So this involves actions such as doing more leadership training, using resources that are developed by the fairly new groups in the Unitarian Universalist Association to focus on Black lives, to focus on people of color, to focus on our LGBTQ community, and to learn from them and about them. And of course, to include more diversity into worship, which is a challenge for us in our community because I often am afraid of doing cultural adaptation, of taking ideas that belong to a different culture and claiming those or using those as our own. That'll be a discussion that we'll have to have as well. And then also to teach about cultural competency, cultural intelligence. Certainly you know about our mental intelligence, our IQs, our intelligent quotient. Maybe you've learned something about emotional intelligence, our EQ, and how we learn to be in tune and in touch with others. But there's also cultural intelligence, cultural competency, where we learn how to interact with people who are from cultures that are not our own. This is something that we need to do some work on. The report talks about restoration and reparations, and this is certainly something that's very controversial, but it's not the first time you've heard that in this congregation. What was and is the role of Unitarians and Universalists in slavery, in cultural genocide, in creating systems of injustice? We have some uncomfortable parts of our history that we need to face, learn about, acknowledge, and deal with. Again, if we truly value our first principle, we must commit to repairing the mistakes of the past. Action steps that the Commission recommends include learning more about the reparations movement, what it means and what it doesn't mean, to learn what is happening in our community here in Charlotte County as far as reparations and what we might be able to encourage. And then finally, they have a chapter about accountability and resources. Currently, there are a lot of rules and expectations for congregations and for ministers, things that we have to follow, ways that I'm supposed to act and not supposed to act, what congregations are supposed to do and not supposed to do. But there's very little accountability. What happens if I violate a covenant? What happens if I break one of the rules? Well, somebody may or may not do something, they may or may not say something to me, but what are the consequences of that? So one of the things that the UUA has to work on together with the UUMA, that's the Ministers Association, is how we hold people and congregations accountable for times when we break covenant with an individual or with a community. We recognize that as Unitarian Universalists, both as the UUA, the denomination, as a congregation, we do not have unlimited resources. We can't simply budget an extra $100,000 for all of this work. So how can we do this in a way that is as frugal as possible while also showing our commitment? Action steps that they recommend or that may impact us includes creating and reporting on congregational goals relative to identifying and repairing harm, something certainly we can do. Coordinating this work with area UU congregations, all the way from Sarasota to Fort Myers to Naples. We have several UU congregations in this part of Florida that we can and I want to continue to work with to do some of this work. We don't have to do it on our own, for sure. And then to also learn about and to identify and implement best practices for inclusion. How can we do this work and learn from others who are doing it, both the mistakes they've made and the lessons they've learned, so that we can do better? This is what I want to encourage us to do. There was also a similar commission that was established to examine institutional racism back in the 1980s for the Unitarian Universalists. And a lot of folks simply don't remember that or weren't aware of it. The report that was issued in 1989 included this observation: the white majority refusal to acknowledge and accept the firsthand racial injustice that people of color, indigenous, and other marginalized groups face within our frames as Unitarian Universalists is maddening to those who actually experience it over and over and over among us. I invite you all to join me in a conversation about UUFCC and race. This is a work we all need to take seriously and for which we are all responsible. This lengthy and detailed report is now in the hands of UUA leadership in Boston. These recommendations are left for our leadership to act on. Let's not wait for Boston for our denomination to act before we do our own work here in Charlotte County. Many who identify as part of the Black, Indigenous, people of color, or LGBTQ+ community and other marginalized communities have experienced harm within our walls here at UUFCC, from the words or actions of our congregation, of our leaders, and of our members. We need to repair that and do better. We have to learn about the past so that we can forge a better future. This timely and detailed report gives us the impetus to keep learning, to keep growing, to keep changing, and to be more welcoming and more inclusive in the future. Amen and blessed be. Sharon has closing words for us.
Okay,
Sharon, go ahead.
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. You're fine.
For our closing words, then, I'd like to share a suggestion described to me by a very wise friend about stories, and more precisely, the conscious and unconscious stories we tell ourselves. The way we tell ourselves stories impacts us more than we might imagine, and it impacts not just what we feel, but how we behave. So, for example, you tell yourself that the food at your living center is terrible. Maybe it's so awful, you're thinking of moving. I want to present my friend's suggestion to you in the form of a short exercise, a numbered exercise today. First, realize that we all tell ourselves stories about what we encounter. Second, now think of an idea you heard in the sermon today. Anything that upset you or made you feel anxious. Or if nothing else, call to mind some personal issue you're struggling with. Next, imagine how you'd tell that idea or issue in the form of a story. How you would narrate it to yourself or to somebody else. Next, step back enough to realize that that story is limited to your perspective. And that means that it's not an absolute truth. It's a story, it's your story. It's a mental construct, your own mental construct. Next, step back once more and tell a new story about the very same issue. What would that different story sound like? What might it be? And last, try out this exercise, knowing that when you change the story you've been telling yourself, when we change the stories we tell ourselves communally, that change has the potential for changing our lives. Go in peace.
Thank you, Sharon. And now we extinguish the chalice, but not the light of hope, the fire of commitment, or the warmth of community. May these ideals shine in our lives and warm our hearts until we are together again. A couple of things I'd like to share for life of the community. Last week I mentioned a new phone tree. Well, we wound up doing some revision on that. We found a few folks who actually weren't included, so I think we have it revised. Hopefully this coming week, you'll hear from somebody by phone, checking in on you, asking how you're doing. Many of you are callers then who will have some other folks to call. So hopefully you'll get a call from our phone tree this coming week. I know I said that last week, but I really, really mean it this time. Also, I mentioned something about having discussions about the report from the Commission on Institutional Change. Last week, we talked about actions of immediate witness. I know that there's a lot of questions about when we might reopen, what we're doing about gathering, and a few other things. I invite you to a town hall with me tomorrow night to ask some of these questions or anything that might be on your mind relative to our ministry here at UUFCC. It'll be tomorrow night, Monday, 7 o'clock. You'll get an email this afternoon with information and a Zoom link. So I invite you to come be a part of that, and let's have a conversation to figure out how we continue to move this conversation down the road to really impact our fellowship and impact our area. Let's sing together now, Go Now in Peace, as we bring our service to a close. We'll try it one more time. Feel free to sing it at home, even if you don't hear the sound yourself. Thank you all again for being here. Please remember, as always, to be a blessing to everyone that you meet as you're out in public. Be a blessing to those that you're sharing a home space with right now during this extra special and turbulent time. But I do say, most importantly, be a blessing to yourself. Extend yourself some grace. Cut yourself a break. We are all going through a lot more stress and pressure than maybe we've ever experienced in our entire lives. And what makes it especially difficult right now is that we don't know when it's going to end. So just be a blessing and be blessed as well. Remember to stick around now for social hour. We invite you to unmute yourself, to share, and to interact. Thank you for being here.